So I'll go ahead and get started while Ken makes his way up. So as I mentioned, we thought that having a panel discussion would be interesting. So I think we're going to take 20, 25 minutes and kind of have a bit of a structured conversation, talk a little bit about some of the challenges or lessons learned that I think have come out of the pilots. I think some of those were anticipated when you all started out on your journey. I think some of the challenges have been a surprise along the way. So it was interesting because GTRI's presentation this week, when John put up that slide that showed kind of the seesaw and the balancing act, I think one thing that I've noticed across all the pilots, you're all doing something differently, but there's been multiple times that you had to look at balancing the 4 guiding principles, especially when it came to privacy and the consent flow and the user experience and in some ways security. So I thought that would be a good topic to kind of start off on, and maybe you can all share kind of some of your insights. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So before actually we get into that, thank you for reminding me. Can you all just kind of go down and introduce yourselves and maybe give a quick update on the pilot and what's new?
Philip Godwin, I'm with
Next to the people online.
Oh, there's a microphone. Sorry. My name's Philip Godwin. I'm with Dayon. Our pilot is the TrustX. We have a commercial product called IDENTIX, which is mobile biometric-based authentication. Part of our pilot is to turn that into a commercial service offering, identity as a service. We have several commercial RPs that we're working with, a major bank that continues to remain anonymous. We actually lost our champion within that bank organization, but they've since assigned a new person, and we've had some meetings with them. Initially, they didn't have any budget, but we now understand he's found some budget, and we have a meeting to schedule at the end of April to talk about use cases. Purdue University has integrated to our service. They have sort of a Mozilla badge kind of a application where in fact, the first badge they designed is called NSTIC 101. And after students complete the course, they have to take an exam, and then they authenticate to the service to get the badge. It's a very small number of people. There's just one class, probably 30 people, but Dr. Elliott's talked to other professors at Purdue to try to get them to use the service as well. AARP, their use case is health vaults access, and they are currently integrating to the service. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, even when you have buy-in from the top level of an organization with an organization of that size, especially when you're dealing with identity, PII, security. You've got to get buy-off at every level. Well, we're finally talking to engineers. They're scheduled for the May sprint. They do monthly sprints. We're scheduled for the May sprint, so their pilot should be going live probably about the 1st of June or thereabouts. Is it too much? I have 3 more pilots to talk about. So. Okay, so PayPal is another one of our RPs. Similar situation with the bank. We lost our champion within PayPal. They moved on, but they've recently assigned a new person. We had a very good meeting with them last week. It looks like we will get something going with them. They're still looking at potential use cases. They have lots of different identity issues that they want to solve. One of the use cases that was mentioned is what they call their merchant agent login. So any vendor or any merchant that accepts PayPal has need for their employees to access their PayPal account to manage transfer funds, whatever. And so they're looking at that's one use case they're considering to offer the merchants to use higher, stronger multi-factor authentication. AAAE was one of our first pilots. Their initial use case was not very compelling. It was just a member portal login, which they could do with a social media account. The extra friction that our enrollment process inserted, people just didn't use the service, even though it was there. So they've since identified a use case that does require strong multi-factor authentication, and they're currently evaluating the market for that. So in a partnership between DAON and AAAE, we operate a service called DTIS, which in the state of Florida does state-mandated background checks. The FBI has a program where an individual can request a copy of their own background check, but the FBI mandates that if you're going to provide that service, you must only allow people to access using multi-factor authentication. So they're currently evaluating the market. Actually, on their Florida website, there's now a survey question that says, if this service was available to you, would you take advantage of it? And various orders. That's only been up for about a month. Probably within the next couple of weeks, they'll make a determination based on that survey. So that's sort of where we are.
Ken Klingenstein, Internet 2. The name of our pilot is Scalable Privacy. And there's a set of components within that. This is pretty much an infrastructure project, unlike some of the other activities which have been more fledgling business opportunity projects. So let me just cover the various touch points quickly. We have a major effort going on around MFA, and there's a couple of outcomes from that. One is over 40 institutions are now deploying MFA, and we're looking at scale kinds of issues associated with it, supporting diversity of MFA devices, etc. In that same activity, we produced some software that's pretty important. It's a multi-context broker for shibboleth. You might say, who cares about shibboleth? Well, there's a large federation over in the corner that's running several thousand sites among law enforcement. Coca-Cola's doing it. Remax is doing it. Major coffee spill over in the corner here. Clean up in aisle 3, I believe. 2, thank you. The State of Israel is using shibboleth. I guess that's no surprise given the name. So this multi-context broker is very useful. It does a lot of management of MFA mechanisms. MFA fails more frequently than regular authentication, so you need to be prepared for failure modes, for example. The doctor may be in a shielded room and can't do his MFA device. The student may be on a dig in Tanzania and has no second factor mechanism. So as we got deep into the MFA space, it became very rich. We have software that tends to compensate for all the challenges of MFA. I'd commend it to you. So that's the MFA piece. We also have return on investment sets of strategies, etc. One thing that gets overlooked in this space is the incredible leverage between federated identity and MFA. And some of you have heard in the past that in the old days, we used to have many MFA devices and sell suspenders to hold all of those tokens so you could get the right token for the right device. And now with federated identity, you just need a single second factor device and it can be used globally. My God, that's huge leverage. So we're trying to sell MFA as good for the community, if not good for yourself. Because now all of your business partners can rely on having a strong authentication mechanism at your institution, and that's very beneficial. So that's the MFA piece. We spent a lot of time on trust marks and trust frameworks. We hope we've made a contribution in that space. You've heard a lot about that over the last few days. I won't go into it except that the focus of our trust mark work is around citizen-centric values, and that's central to our effort. So we're looking at a trust mark for accessibility, a trust mark. We'd like to work with the ID.me folks around a veterans mark. There's some very interesting stuff. We're beginning to categorize the privacy space in terms of marks. It isn't one mark, folks. Obviously, there's many different activities that happen, many different transaction modalities. So most of our work, for example, is in transactional privacy, the release of attributes to a relying party. That's very different than privacy at rest, which is where the PII kinds of guidelines come in, and PCI kinds of stuff, etc. So we haven't framed yet what the mark space for privacy will look like, and that's a really important thing for us to do. In all of this, we're trying to keep the number of marks simple. As I might have mentioned, we're doing a privacy manager where that mark permeates through from where it might be contained in the metadata to the eyeball of the user, so the user can make an informed decision about whether or not to release attributes. So that's some of the work that we're doing in terms of the trust marks and trust frameworks. All of this feeds into the metadata space. I would just comment to all of you who are starting to build federations, and it's wonderful to see that the age of static metadata is passing. We are leaving Etsy hosts behind for DNS of metadata, dynamic metadata exchanges. Those protocols are coming along. They're very useful, and we now have several working interoperable workings of that. Let's see. We've stumbled into a large mess with attributes, no surprise here. We're thrilled that we've passed the authentication space behind. You know, I was pleased that we could all agree that we don't care anymore whether it's OpenID Connect or SAML or PKI with little things stuck into odd crevices of a certificate. What we really care about is the payloads, the attributes, and that's a mess. And that's going to be very poignant for us because we're putting attributes in front of end users, and they need to understand what these attributes mean and the syntax and semantics of that. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Let's see. We spent some time on anonymous credentials. We're going to continue to spend more time on anonymous credentials. It remains the only mechanism for doing the unobservability requirement of the original NSTIC principles. I have concerns about some of the double-blind strategies that are being used. I think we're being asked to trust the operator of the double-blind, and I don't know. Yeah, right. So there's been some interesting work done about how can I create a marketplace of third parties. And I just point out to you that there's some work being done in Europe around a marketplace of third parties to make the double-blind not be owned, both sides of the double-blind being owned by the same organization. You don't want that. You really want a marketplace, and there are ways of doing that. So anonymous credentials, there are 2 or 3 technologies out there. None of them are ready for prime time yet. Good Lord, it's been a long time since Stefan Brand's thesis, and it's still not ready for prime time. But that said, you know, it's cool technology. You just look at it, and it's way cool. So it goes. Let's see. Changing the world is hard. I think we'll all talk about that. Let me just talk then about the privacy manager. I think that's the last element. So the Privacy Manager is a piece of software that's being developed out of Carnegie Mellon University. Again, it manages transactional privacy. Tomorrow we're having our first rollout to a couple of institutions that are going to deploy it. We're calling this program Lifestyles of the Attribute Rich and Privacy Preserved. So we're trying to create privacy envy. You know, among this, you know, just the way there is affluence envy, I guess, and we'll see how the deployments work. Out of time. Okay, I'll just say that the getting one of the big issues here, and one thing I'd like to see NSTIC do is start to normalize at least the metadata about common attributes, so that we can look up and see, do you reassign email addresses? Oh, you do? Well, I'm not going to use it as an anchor anymore for my applications, etc. So just some kind of registry about the metadata that major IDPs and SPs use would be very helpful to making this work well.
Oh, I didn't know if there was a question. I know Kay was kind of waving.
I think it's a question that's in relation to Ken's. I don't know if you want to take it now or later. If you want, sure. Okay. Okay.
So I'm Mike Farnsworth, and I lead the Cross-Sector Digital Identity Initiative. We are a public-private consortium. Our membership includes the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, which is kind of the liaison between all 50 states, Canadian provinces, and several of the Mexican states in the motor vehicle space. We also have the Commonwealth of Virginia, specifically the Department of Motor Vehicles. We have involvement from Microsoft, Computer Associates, and then BioSig. as one of our credential service providers. The premise of our pilot has been to take social credentials, commercial creds that are freely available, and actually give them greater purpose by augmenting them with some verified attributes from some authoritative sources, and then also leverage some of the identity proofing that we do in the motor vehicle space. And interestingly enough, that's kind of expanded into other identity proofing venues as we've kind of evolved our pilot. Our first relying party that we're actually targeting is Inova Health System, which is one of the largest health systems out of Northern Virginia. Specifically, we're targeting 2 use cases with them: patient enrollment to access their electronic health records through their portal, as well as provider access with strong multi-factor identity-proof credentials to actually access the health system. The particular value proposition for Inova in that scenario is to handle non-network providers, or those providers that are not native to their health system but still need to access their information. Also, our second relying party that's following right behind that, I'll actually kind of give you an update on the Inova. We're actually targeting launching later this month with that patient access use case, and then we'll be following very shortly thereafter, probably in May, with the provider scenario. We're kind of juggling a little bit of the scheduling within Inova because they're actually onboarding another health system into their infrastructure, so we're trying to make sure that we don't burden them with new technology and new things that may impede that. Our second relying party is the state of Georgia. We're actually getting ready to kick off our engagement with them to define the use cases. They have a handful of targeted use cases to their constituent population that we're looking to kind of bring into the fold, and they'll actually be our second relying party that we're kind of targeting. And I've got a lot of comments about some of the other stuff, but I'll hold that until we get to the panel part.
Perfect.
Good morning. I'm Dave Cox with Criterion Systems. We've got a whole slew of pilots that we're running in parallel, but for those of you who haven't heard me talk, we've built and have deployed on Amazon Web Services a credential and attribute exchange network. Our pilot is really to prove out the business model associated with that transaction hub. We have a whole portfolio of identity providers with high assurance credentials, Symantec and Verizon, down to low assurance credentials, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. And then we have attribute providers, some of which are commercial attribute providers such as LexisNexis, Experian, Equifax, AT&T, TransUnion Data. We have authoritative sources from different relying party sources in a federation model. But the purpose of the hub is really to implement credential and attribute federation exchange. So it is a contractual hub as well. So we have a series of use cases that we're rolling out, some of which start with just identity proofing use cases for identity providers who can acquire on a competitive basis KBA or attribute verification sources or device ID sources or biometric sources. So we've onboarded a whole host of different attribute sources, attribute providers, and commercial providers, and we act as a transaction hub for that as a reseller. The other thing is we built in, it's a user-centric environment, so the privacy by design is built in. We don't store the attribute information in our exchange. It's only available and to be managed by the user, so it complies with what would be EU regulations for storing in the local country of residence. The first pilot that we started out with was with a pilot under Department of Homeland Security called the Next Generation Incident Command System. In fact, yesterday I was down in LA, and I walked in. It was the users group for this portal that was built from the ground up, and there were about 300 law enforcement, first responders of various type, firefighters, and these are, I felt like a duck out of water here because everybody's in uniform, and I was the only person walking in there. But this has actually gone international now. We had Australian, the chief of police. This is if you will, a mashup environment where they can bring in satellite overlay and real-time incident command information. What we've done is we've deployed the ability to log in with a Google and PayPal credential initially. Attribute verification is part of that. They generate an account. Heretofore, they've had to do that with an out-of-bound method where somebody had to be a sponsor for the first responder. The second stage is we're bringing in the CAL FIRE credential, actually, to allow them to, a user, to authenticate to the service directly using their credential from their enterprise, and we will be able to then verify other attributes out of band or take them through the SAML flow that comes with that particular credential. And the other thing is really interesting is, as a community, they've had a hard time with having responders register, and so we're building out an affinity program strategy with them so they can go to the community and provide discounts to first responders who actually get verified through the process. So that's sort of our pathway on that pilot. The second pilot would be Broadridge. That's the broker-dealer community, about 140 million investors in this community. They're rolling out a new pilot platform called Fluent, in which you will be able to go up there and the community of all your broker-dealer investors, most of them people here are investors, I assume, would be able to go up and get information like your proxy statements and any updates on your investment accounts, and then with a single click be able to log in and do a trade. And that's a mobile device platform that'll be rolled out initially in the Amazon environment under Kindle, and with iOS subsequently with the Google Play Store environment as a native app. That's happening. Actually, that pilot, first of all, the next pilot for DHS launched in January. We're in the various stages of that implementation. The contract signed with Broadridge. The soft internal launch was on March 20th. And April 29th is the new date for the live launch. We're finalizing the T's and C's on the contract as we speak. That's been a big lesson learned for us. The next pilot is general, and there are two pilots under Broadridge, by the way. So the first one is Fluent, the other one is for proxyvote.com or another consumer-facing service. So bring your own identity, you can get access to your information. The next pilot is with General Electric. We have two pilots with General Electric. One is a supply chain enterprise pilot using some attribute-based access control strategy, as well as bring your own identity. Or even a General Electric credential if you wanted to. We will verify device ID on the fly every time the user logs in. They go through a registration flow. After that, it's happening behind the scenes. And the second pilot with General Electric will be more of a consumer-facing pilot, probably in the healthcare space, so it's another high-assurance credential requirement. From there, the Census is the next pilot that we're working on. The Census Department of Commerce, thanks to the NSTIC PMO, they've been a tremendous amount of help here, wants to move 70% of the census for 2020 online. And that will save billions of dollars. So the first part of the pilot is a demographic survey in our region, in Washington, D.C. Usually these are about half a million people, but they're going to scale it down to test it out. So you'll go and do a pre-registration step using a third-party credential. I think it's Google and PayPal because they're FICAM compliant. And you will go to the census site. You'll fill out information to get verified and bound to that credential. They'll verify your email as part of that as an out-of-band method, and maybe a device ID. They'll send you an email within 30 days from that, and it'll give you a notification that if you complete the census online with this credential, it's a single click, but we'll give you some benefits, and it's either going to be a coupon program or discount programs. This will be heavily marketed. We're going through a series of trials over the next few years. The goal is to move of us, who are citizens of the United States, 70% of us online. That's a huge initiative and a big cost savings to the government.
Thanks.
That's it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention, I know that a lot of the pilots had to speak awfully fast because we only gave them a few minutes to kind of give an overview of their projects and an update. I think the IDESG archives all the previous presentations, so if there are any newcomers that would like more background on what each of the pilots are doing, you can probably go online and look up past presentations to get an idea of their overall project. Today was really meant to just give an update on where they are with their pilots and deployments and production. So I guess back to the panel piece. We haven't really orchestrated this. I don't know who wants to kind of talk first on some of your thoughts around balancing the guiding principles and
No, I'm not shy.
Yeah, I know you're not shy.
You know I'm not shy. Well, it's interesting, Kat, because I actually wanted to kind of tie back, I think, to the previous presentation that Michigan had talked about. And I think Kimberly had a question about some of the considerations around ensuring that data doesn't leave the state we actually have been wrestling with that, trying to align. You figure you have 50 states, you have a whole bunch of authoritative data sources, and how do you account for the differences? Some states have different statutes and laws that allow for data sharing. Some don't. For Virginia, for example, our data doesn't leave the state. We actually had to make some significant architectural changes in our attribute verification and attribute provider part of our architecture to account for that, so that we're only providing a match, no match, and we're actually only verifying what the user is actually providing, and not actually providing the information back. So we had to make some significant design changes in order to account for that. And I think going to the point around the IDESG guiding principles, when we start looking at things such as minimal disclosure, what type of information we can share, making sure that we preserve the ability to not have them traceable or linkable or things like that, balancing that with the easy-to-use component about the user experience, it kind of all starts to mesh together. And so it took a significant amount of effort for us to break that apart. Kudos to the Privacy Committee, because one of the tools that we leveraged to really break that apart was the PEM. And for those the pilots that did the PEM, it's a very daunting exercise, and those pilots that are going through it. But what I can actually say is that it was actually a very valuable tool for us, because it actually caused us to decompose that interaction to a way that we could clearly articulate where that data was exactly in each point in the transaction. Especially since our ecosystem is so distributed. We have, attribute providers and attribute verifiers and credential service providers and the relying parties and what's going here and there. So, the kind of adhering to those was kind of a very interesting adventure.
That's it. So we have a whole portfolio of use cases that we support. Enterprise use cases, B2C use cases, B2B business to consumer attribute-based access control, business to consumer affiliation use cases, which is community. So it turns out that all the vendors that are on the exchange, all of our partners, are very sensitive to privacy and use of data. And we have contractual obligations with the flow-down terms in our agreements to make sure that there's a lot of vetting in the process. And it turns out the relying parties are even as sensitive to privacy, and we're grateful for the ability to be able to talk to their constituents about what they're doing in these cases to enhance user privacy and to respect the use of information in the environment. So all that was not so much of an issue. There's definitely trade-offs in the usability of an interface with a user with privacy and security, and how many gates you have to go through as a user to actually create an account and then reuse it. So we've done a lot of work with device ID technologies and things that make the user experience very seamless going forward, but also provide risk mitigation required for the specific use case that the relying party is trying to exploit. And by the way, relying party to us is a service, as opposed to General Electric, which has thousands of relying parties. The healthcare use cases are different from consumer-facing use cases. So they're really targeting a constituency who's trying to get access to a use case. The employee use cases, they're definitely going to be doing a lot more divulgence of information because they're getting paid to be there. But a consumer use case is a lot more, a lot different.
So let me drill down on one of the IDESG principles, interoperability, and suggest that it's a lot more sophisticated than we understand it right now. I'll give you a few examples. Yesterday, Philip and I had a conversation about OpenID Connect versus SAML, and we agreed we didn't care anymore. And most people would say, gee, those aren't interoperable protocols. Well, at what level? So we're trying to make sure that our metadata is interoperable among those protocols. We run gateways, social to SAML, that are very successful. People are now developing SAML to social gateways. So interoperability can happen there. It's just, not on the surface of, oh, you're using one protocol and we're using the other. Another place for interoperability issues is going to be around the user interface. And so, quick conversation. For the privacy manager we're trying to develop, we're working hard to make sure that it works for non-SAML flows, that it can be used with UMA, that it can be used with OpenID Connect. It could probably be used with PKI if we figured out how to use PKI at all. The UI piece there, so I had a conversation with Scott Cantor, and I said, so the privacy manager, how much of that can be reused, Scott's Mr. SAML, how much of that can be used in non-SAML environments? And he goes, throw it all away. And I went, wait, what do you mean? And he goes, well, the libraries won't work. And I go, what about the user interface? What about the log files of your history so you know what you're releasing to other places? What about the informed consent infrastructure that we're building? And Scott went, oh, well, that should work across lots of different environments. So from the user eyeball view, we need to make the user interface consistent regardless of what technology you're using. So getting the interoperability at the right level and with the right approach, I think is going to be critical to make the ecosystem and NSTIC successful.
So we are partnered with Purdue University, and one of the things that Purdue did for us is they conducted a privacy assessment of our service early on and gave us a lot of really valuable feedback, things that we hadn't considered, just some simple things that we overlooked, like this value is not being encrypted or where a particular piece of information is being stored, etc. So that was really valuable to us. Plus, our financial model is actually based on having the relying party pay for the service on behalf of the subscriber. Oh, sorry. And so we actually sort of have a little bit of a false start in that since the RP was paying, we sort of initially started building out an RP-centric service and then very quickly realized that that made it very tough to ensure privacy and so forth. So that's about it there.
Just one last thing. We found that relying parties like the idea of, in a session, let's say you start and use a social credential to log in, but you want to move money or something like that. Contextual methods for elevating trust in the session are really popular because they do a couple things. One, the user's motivated to go forward in the transaction for whatever that transaction is. Second is that you can minimize your costs if you constantly use a method that is expensive when a user comes to a site, that begins to accrue as a cost element. So that's a consideration. So the trade-offs there. Privacy is definitely an important part of all that in terms of getting the user to consent through the process. So you don't want to necessarily ask them to expose a lot of information unless it's appropriate for the context.
Well, I got one.
You got one.
I got one. So you talked about some feedback you've had from relying parties. I think some of the feedback I'm hearing from the plenary is they're interested in understanding as well the relying party aspect and their perspective. So can you talk about maybe some of the motivations that you've seen for relying parties to actually adopt an NSTIC solution, or maybe some of the impediments or barriers?
I can probably start there, and I'm sure we'll pass it on. So it was very interesting. You can imagine when we first approached Inova Healthcare and said, hey, would you ever let somebody log in with, say, a Google, a Facebook, a Live, a Twitter account to let them access their electronic health record? You can imagine what the response was. It was actually a very interesting conversation. And what we started to find as we talked through it is that from the relying party standpoint, and I'll kind of take two kind of views on this. One from a commercial side, which is, say, Inova Health System, who is looking at ways that they can improve the continuum of care for their patients. I mean, that's really what their business driver is. That's their motivation behind this. And improving that while reducing their costs and their burden. And right now, they actually have to do an enormous amount of identity proofing themselves. It's a burdensome process, it's a very expensive process, and it's also a very expensive process for them to actually maintain the credential. But the context of the the authentication itself and the use of the tokens and the credentials is all contained within the technology arm. Meaning, the technology department is responsible for that. However, the establishment of the identity of the patient is all handled under the registration folks. So when we actually started talking to what we realized out of the gate was that in order for the relying parties to actually engage, we really had to take the conversation out of the context of identity and out of the context of authentication and really target their business flow and their business process, because it actually requires a little bit of business process reengineering in order for it to actually be successful and for it to resonate. Then we had to engage with their privacy folks, their regulatory folks, their legal folks, the contractual folks. So I think one of the barriers that we kind of encountered is that when we first started, we were kind of fragmented in going after the individual units, whether it be the technology, the business, the contractual folks, and it really wasn't the composite approach where we had the full picture from all of the constituents within ANOVA in order for us to actually provide the services.
So, for the most part, relying parties that we've talked to are trying to solve a problem. And if they're creating a new service, they're really open to a lot of different approaches. If it's an existing or legacy service, not so much, because you're having to go in there and do some transformation in their enterprise about their processes. So, they're really not thinking, oh, how do I deal with usability or privacy initially? It's like, how do I solve a problem? How do I make money or save money? And then after they've delved into it, the rest of the stakeholders jump in. You got, like Mike was saying, the legal folks, the privacy folks, the security folks, the infrastructure folks are all getting in there and having their say, which is normal, and that takes a lot of time. I mean, because this message about NSTIC and everything we're doing is not commonly known in the market space. You go out there and you talk to people in the market space, they say, what's that about? And you have to start the conversation over and over again. You could probably push some button on my arm and I'll start spewing out NSTIC stuff over and over again. I've got that recorded someplace in my DNA at this point. But that's just part of what you have to do.
Yeah, so with the RPs that we've talked to, we get a lot of resistance in a lot of different areas. So for one, many of them want to be their own IDP. They may be holding hundreds of millions or tens of millions of identities already because they're major banks or insurance companies or whatever. And so they're like, we have no need for you. We're going to do it ourselves. Also, we can get buy-in at all the different levels of the different organizations that you're talking about, but then when we hit the security group, they're like, no, there's no way we're ever going to farm out that piece of our system. So those are two of the areas where we've run into the most friction.
So the good news is that there is a tipping point, and we've tipped. I guess that you do that with cows, I guess, in the fields, but we've tipped. So you can't become a new service for at least the large segment of the R&E community that we're trying to motivate. You can't become a new service offering without embracing in common and federated identity. It's just a requirement. And that leads to a healthy consulting business because many relying parties aren't quite there yet. But there is a tipping point.
Great. So I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, and I'm guessing Kay is going to cut me off at 10:30. So, but I quickly, before we go into questions, if there were one or two things that would have made your pilot execution easier, or is there something even going forward that could, come out of the IDESG or be supported by the IDESG? What would those be? Not to take up too much time.
Market awareness.
Market awareness.
And I think, you go to talk to people and they say, this is really cool stuff. Who else is doing it? Where are the 50 other large corporations involved? And that really definitely slows down. So I think, as Ken said, as the market begins to shift to a tipping point, it'll really happen quicker. It all gets down to making sure that we're addressing the motivations of the different constituents in the market properly and messaging that consistently.
So market awareness to the relying parties or to the
Well,
individuals or who?
Relying parties, consumers. I think the folks, at least in our environment, that are vendors or attribute providers or identity providers, they get it. They're in the business. But going to talk to the general population or enterprises, they understand there are things going on, but they need to basically be messaged more appropriately at a very high level and then for different targeted audiences.
And I'll kind of add into that. The communication and the messaging in a consistent fashion going out to the participants is critical. One of the things that we wrestled with at the beginning of our pilot was how do we take all of these business, the legal, the technical components, how do we articulate them in a consistent fashion that all the participants can actually understand? And I know there's been an enormous amount of work within the IDESG coming out of these committees around building the frameworks, building models, building analytic devices. We had some of the tools that kind of came from the NPO that we used in order to start to build on. But over time and over about the last 18 months since we started, we started to see a lot more of these devices coming out of the committees. And I would encourage us to continue that and make them more robust, because it kind of goes to Dave's point. When you're going out to communicate to somebody, and I'll just use an example, and you start talking to them about levels of assurance, the first thing everyone does is they go to NIST 863. And, we've heard resoundingly how that applies to the federal government, and I know we've had some work with some of the cross-pilot about trying to articulate a consistent message for the commercial sector. But I think had we had some of these tools earlier on, it probably would have helped catalyze ourselves. We got off to a slow, rocky start. It took us a good 9 months to a year to really get our legs underneath us, and then once we gained our stride, we actually had these templates and models to build on, and so I think a lot of that is a very beneficial tool.
So I will also echo the messaging comment and say that we need to get the message out clearer. We've been talking, several of us, about redoing the initial animation that the NSTIC site had with working code. We can do that now. We can actually show that the puck has moved a little bit. The other messaging moment would be around teachable moments. I don't think, frankly, the IDESG or the NPO is doing enough to say, in a properly working identity ecosystem, that event wouldn't have happened because of these principles. So teachable moments are really important, and we're not teaching folks that could have been prevented had the world been constructed slightly different.
Yeah, I'd agree completely with everything there. Just add one example. We've actually had multiple RPs that we've met with that have said, who don't understand federated identity in the sense that they go, it sounds like I'm just going to enable my competitor. If my customer can use the credential I gave them to go log in into my competitor across the street, I'm just enabling my competitor. So that's kind of some of the attitudes that are out there.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure, Philip, you have some thoughts on certification challenges and some other things we wanted to get to, but but I don't think we have time. So I'll go ahead. But don't we want to leave time for questions? Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to drive, but I want to let you guys drive. So.
Hi there. This is a couple questions. Ken, I think, or Dave, you're going to be kind of the recipient of most of these. First question is probably a pretty simple one. Attributes, stale attributes, attribute refresh, DNS, kind of to the attribute when you're talking about that. What time frame are you talking about? How long is an attribute valid for? Is it a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day cycle? That kind of thing. Just guidance on that. And then the second comment or the second question is a little more difficult, but you can find a way to answer it. Are you dealing in exchanges or broker environments where the attribute is encrypted all the way from the attribute provider, IDP, CSP, attribute provider to the RP, and to the point on the double blind, never actually seen by, in clear text, by the broker in the middle? So appreciate the comments on both of those.
So attribute refresh is a variable that a relying party selects for their service. It's a policy, quite frankly. Each relying party decides what they need. If you were an identity provider that is consuming the service for attribute verification through the exchange, they also select that. So they could say, when we do a proofing, we issue a credential, and every once in a while I want to have those attributes associated with that user refreshed. In our model, the relying party is the customer, in generally speaking. So the identity provider, if they're consuming it, act as a relying party. They just set the policy for the refresh rate of the attributes. And that can be anything from a device ID, which is every time you come in and log in, to a biometric, which is in a contextual framework, or every time you log in, to attributes for a user that get refreshed periodically. In the second question,
And Dave, what are you seeing on the user-based attributes? Are you seeing, sure, my eye is not going to change much for a biometric, right? Device ID, I want every time I log in within 2-minute window or something like that. I get that. But on the user-based attributes, is it 60 days? Does LexisNexis provide you the data every, real time? How does that?
So the user always has to be present in the exchange in order for a refresh to occur. So that's just the way our model works. It's always user-centric. So the user, let's say the relying party says 6 months, and the user doesn't come in until the 7th month. When they actually log in, it happens behind the scenes. The user's already granted consent in the flow. So it really depends on that. In terms of clear text, first of all, the exchange does not store the attributes in the exchange, and we do not have access to it. All the transactions are done with TLS, so it's all encrypted in the transport mechanism, and everything's done in a way that doesn't expose that. So we also have some technology we built into our exchange flow that we call it a process firewall, so that any processes that are abnormal to the standard transaction flows get tagged and diverted or killed, that we built into it.
And I'll probably just real quickly add on to that, because one of the things that our policies around the attributes are actually policy driven as well, and they're really determined by the relying party. But another interesting thing on the exchange of the information, our model and architecture, we actually don't exchange any of the attributes. They actually don't traverse across. We're actually doing matching and no matching, so the user is actually claiming the attributes, and then we're verifying them, so they're actually user provided. They're not provided from the authoritative source. And then we have some of the cryptography about those hashes and how we're handling the actual verification flags of it, so that you can ensure the downstream integrity of it.
So I want to untangle two things that got tangled in your question. The DNS stuff was all around the metadata. And for us to reduce our metadata bundle was growing huge, and as we get more trust marks in the metadata, more end entities in the metadata, we have to move to something dynamic. In terms of the attribute space, I think Mike began down a path of we need to distinguish between self-asserted attributes, sources of authority, and vetted attributes. And I think we need to structure the space to begin with, and then we can come back and revisit your question. By the way, everything is encrypted on the wire. Most things at rest depend upon the sanctity of the system that they're being contained in for security. So I do think we want to structure the space, and then the self-asserted stuff can be, you're asserting it, and as Dave said, it's real time. The sources of authority stuff is where I think we get into the interesting things, and some of that stuff is fairly persistent, and some is not. And then I think the other associated issue with this is we're entering a world where we're going to need to show more attributes to users and have them understand what we're talking about. I love Denise Taylor's use case around she doesn't want common name as the attribute that's displayed in an under 13 site. You need a display name that is pseudonymous or somewhat opaque, because that's the rules of the game. So we already have an attribute that does that. It has a geeky name. How do we take that attribute, which is already in all the schema that we know about, and begin to socialize it to the community as this is your name you use when you go to a chat room and you want to preserve privacy? Interesting issue.
Yeah, we only use user-asserted attributes and don't really exchange attributes.
One last piece to your...
Oh, yeah.
So we're also user-sorted. We generate claims. We're a claims management system. Authoritative stores that are used for attribute-based access control typically get verified in context. For example, an employment status or security clearance or the fact that you are on a project team may get verified every time, as opposed to a commercial attribute source such as doing PII verification may get done 6 months or once a year.
So we'll take one more from the room because you guys have been standing for a while, and then I know Kay let me know there's someone online waiting.
Actually, Peter, my first comment would be around sources of authority. There is this architectural solution we came up with a couple of years ago called Street Identity that I would suggest you take a look at because it does actually address some of those that are an architectural issue. And some of that might even be built into ID data if it survived. The general question here is, right at the moment, we have this collection of unnamed and unidentified set of participants who have just made it through some set of gates to the next level. And while maintaining a totally positive set of statements around this, what could you suggest is actually the success criteria or the way to actually get through for those participants to actually be successful in terms of engaging both with the NSTIC program office and the IDESG for actually getting set up to be as productive as possible quickly? And for the non-spin answers, I'm available at coffee afterwards.
Is that for a pilot proposal?
Indeed.
Okay. Oh, make sure you communicate frequently, openly, and have your strategy well defined. I don't know, for you guys, for all of us, we got into the process very quickly and then realized that we needed to change our architecture to comply with NSTIC, which we did. And there were also a lot of assumptions we made about getting contracts done in a timely fashion with relying parties, which were huge. And so we needed to adjust our schedule and our thinking accordingly. So if you have outside participants in your ecosystem that you're dealing with, be very conservative about your estimates for how long it takes at this stage in the ecosystem.
I would echo that. External dependencies are probably the biggest barrier, and that's one of the things that we've really had to wrestle with, especially since we are a consortium of many different commercial organizations. Also, if you do have external partnerships, considering a lot of the interplay between commercial organizations and what's important to them, making sure that you can align that with your actual delivery schedule. That's probably one of the most critical things that we've been tackling.
I'd say the new pilots leverage what's been done. I think that Mike did a great job early on with the trust frameworks and trust mark stuff, and I think we've, as a community, really advanced all of that stuff by leveraging each other. I think that's a real win. I don't think we've leveraged each other at all in terms of the attribute space. We're all creating new attributes or misnaming existing attributes or misusing them. So I don't think there's been any coordination around the mess that's growing up in the attribute space, and I think that's something that we should be sharing.
I think for us it would be to choose compelling use cases. So we have kind of a sexy technology. We think a lot of the RPs we've talked to think it's sexy, and they go, oh yeah, this seems like a really cool way to try this out. But then they use it in our process adds a little bit of friction to the enrollment because it's biometric based. So you got to register your face, you got to register your voice. There's several steps to the enrollment. And if it's not a compelling use case, people won't complete that enrollment. And so we set up a pilot with AAAE. The very first pilot, we had one person that actually finished the enrollment. They're like, I'm not going to do all this just to log into my log into a website. So careful choice of use cases.
No, that's a great point, Philip. And I know Jeremy earlier this week alluded that we've started up these pilot collaboration meetings where we do get the pilots all together on the phone or in a room. And I think the value proposition to the individual has come up a few times about the importance of there's not only the value proposition to the relying party, but also the individual, because there is an investment sometimes on the part of the individual to actually engage with the ecosystem, and you can't undermine the importance of that. So can I take a call from the... online?
Say the user experience.
Yes.
That's key.
Yeah.
Okay, can I go ahead just with this?
Yes, please.
The remote question comes from Kimberly with no last name. Are you finding that the federated structures are providing for a strong tie between breach origination and legal accountability? A lot of the tech is about recording end-user activities, but not untrusted insiders' activity records.
It depends on the use case. If for enterprise use cases, there are a lot of tools you can use to mitigate risk. And we're doing some work in our other company with the government agencies on attribute-based access control, for example, which brings in a lot of contextual information to accessing objects that could be stored encrypted through a policy engine that may be a XACML-based policy engine, for example. You can do a lot of things. It's just a matter of whether you have budget and time. And in the context of consumer use cases, there are also a lot of tools that you could deploy. It gets down to friction, usability, as well as how much privacy is involved, and whether consumers will actually go through it. That's what we've experienced. The trade-offs.
Yeah, and I'll kind of build on that as well. Another thing that's been kind of in our radar is balancing the technology aspect of it, about how you handle that, along with the legal and the liability aspect of it, and how you account for that in your trust framework or in your contractual agreements, especially when you have a distributed ecosystem with multiple participants of different types. Each one carries different liability risk. They're all kind of participating in different roles. And how do you actually allocate that liability? How do you actually allocate that risk across the participants? That's another very key area of focus.
I think this may speak to a business that Andrew might have been creating somewhere along the way. But as you spread federated identity, some relying parties actually want to know when an identity has been breached at the IDP. Would the IDP send out a notice to relying parties? Now, we don't necessarily know who those relying parties are, and these are typically at the higher levels of assurance. But if there's been an account compromise, how do you notify relying parties about that vulnerability? We think there may be a tie-in with LOA. As you move to higher LOA, your responsibilities for notifying about breaches, etc., also escalates. We'll see if that takes off.
So I heard the word insider in there, and so just say in our system we actually use our administrators have to use strong multi-factor authentication access. They can only there's very limited information that they can see that's not encrypted, non-reputable audit trails, all those kinds of controls are in place.
So I don't know, Kay, how much more time will you give us?
It cuts in a little bit to the break, but we'll be back in this room. I don't know if you want to take one more question.
Okay.
Hi, Peter Jezik, individual. There's been good discussion about the user experience with the technology interface. Can you talk about the user experience with the support process? It's one thing to enable a help desk to support a monolithic transaction. It's another thing to enable a help desk to support a transaction that takes place in an ecosystem.
So usually the touch points are going to be at the authentication event and the authorization event in an ecosystem that's federated like this. So if you fail authentication, your credential fails you, then you've got a help desk typically for the identity provider. That's one of the, in some cases, not necessarily all the consumer-facing credentials will do that, but you have some recourse about how to deal with that. On the authorization side, which is typically done by the relying party, at least in our context, that is again, where you're either authorized the service because you met the criteria or the requirements to be authenticated, and you have appropriate attributes to do what you're allowed to do. That happens there. In the verification process, which we have, if you fail, for example, a KVA service, or your attributes are not verifiable through the commercial sources or the authoritative sources, then what we do is we provide a recourse, a message to the authorization server, the relying party, that this happened for these reasons. Either the claims came back, they didn't match, and then they provide the service to support recourse for mitigating those issues.
And it's interesting, it's such a timely question for us because we're actually right now in the throes of doing this. So when we're actually developing our user experience, one of our core premises was how do we minimize the friction or the amount of interaction that the user has to have in order to accomplish the task at hand. And that has a direct correlation to the complexity of the transaction, which the help desk is then required to support. And so that's one of the things in designing the user flow and the user experience. How do you actually have a consolidated help desk that knows where to reach for the problems? And we're actually trying to determine that now in our pilot, because knowing that we're entering into the pilot piece, we have a controlled population. But once we release it to the entire patient population, the game changes. And then how do you move out of the kind of analyzing the impact into now you're actually in production support for the masses. And so choices you made earlier on, now you have to actually handle them as part of the support matrix.
That's a great question, and there are no good answers right now. As Dave said, frequently the Auth-Z decision is the relying party decision, and they may handle it however they choose. In our consent-driven model, the Auth-Z failure may be because you didn't release the right sets of attributes to the relying party, and at that point we give you the highly informative error message 404, file not found.
So yeah, actually in our case, most of the times the RPs say they want to handle the customer service aspects of it. And we've tried to set things up so that there are very, very few cases where an end user subscriber would actually have to contact our service. They would contact the RP, and then of course we provide 24/7 to the RP.
All right. Thank you. We got to stop. All right. Thank you. Maybe you can follow up offline with the pilot team. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you for the brief.